6 days before my father died, someone drove him to a notary's office to sign a new will, and the only person who went with him was the stepmother I'd known for less than 3 years. My name is Halvard, and I want to walk you through exactly how I found out, because the discovery itself unraveled faster than almost anything I've ever lived through. This story does not slow down. Stay with me. Fast context, because the pace only accelerates from here. My father built a successful commercial real estate management company over 35 years, starting with a single small apartment building and growing it, over decades, into a company that managed dozens of properties across the region. I'd worked alongside him for the past 12 years, learning the business from the ground up, and it had always been understood, discussed openly, repeatedly, at family gatherings, in casual conversation, in a way that felt as settled as any fact of my life, that I would eventually inherit both the company and the bulk of his estate, with a smaller, separate provision for my younger sister, Cordelia, who had never worked in the business and had always been content with that arrangement. My father remarried about 3 years before he died, to a woman named Ingeborg, following the death of my mother roughly 5 years earlier. I want to be honest that my relationship with Ingeborg had always been polite but distant, not hostile, not warm, simply the kind of careful, formal relationship that sometimes exists between adult children and a parent's second spouse, especially one who entered the family relatively late. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer roughly 8 months before he died, a diagnosis that came, as these diagnoses often do, with a devastatingly short prognosis once the full staging was understood. I want to tell you that the final months of his illness were, in their own specific way, some of the most meaningful of my entire relationship with him. Long conversations, business planning discussions where he walked me through details of the company I hadn't fully understood before, a genuine, deliberate closeness that I've held on to since as one of the only comforting parts of an otherwise devastating period. He died at home, in hospice care, roughly 2 weeks after the point where his doctors told us his decline had entered its final stage. I want to walk you through the 6 days before his death specifically, because it's the window that ended up mattering enormously to everything that followed, and because, at the time, I had no idea anything significant was happening during it at all. 6 days before he died, Ingeborg told me, mid-morning, that she was taking my father to a doctor's appointment, a detail I registered without any particular scrutiny, because by that point in his illness, appointments, palliative consultations, medication adjustments, the ordinary logistics of end-of-life care, were happening frequently, and I had no reason to question the specifics of any individual one. They were gone for nearly 4 hours, considerably longer than a routine appointment would typically take, a detail I remember noting mildly at the time but not questioning, because my father's stamina and scheduling had become genuinely unpredictable in those final weeks, and long, unexplained gaps had become, unfortunately, a normal part of that period. I found out what had actually happened during those 4 hours roughly 3 weeks after my father's funeral, when the estate attorney, not our longtime family attorney, whom I'd expected to be handling everything, but a different attorney entirely, one I'd never met or heard of before, contacted me to schedule a will reading. I want to describe the exact moment I understood something was deeply wrong, because it happened almost immediately, within the first few minutes of that reading, and it did not stop escalating for the rest of that meeting. The will the attorney read from was dated 6 days before my father's death. Not the will I had known about for years, drafted a decade earlier by our longtime family attorney, the one that clearly, explicitly named me as majority inheritor of both the company and the bulk of the estate. A new one, recent, signed, according to the document itself, at a notary's office across town, witnessed by 2 employees of that office and, according to the attorney's own explanation, accompanied that day by exactly one family member, Ingeborg. I want to tell you what the new will actually said, because the changes were not minor adjustments. They were a complete, fundamental restructuring of everything I'd understood about my father's intentions. The company, previously slated to come to me outright, was now to be held in a trust, with Ingeborg named as sole trustee and primary beneficiary of trust income, with no defined mechanism or timeline for eventual transfer of ownership to me at all. The bulk of the estate's liquid assets, savings, investment accounts, a modest but meaningful real estate portfolio separate from the company itself, had been reallocated almost entirely to Ingeborg, with what remained for me and Cordelia reduced to a small fraction of what the original will had specified. I sat in that attorney's office, roughly 3 weeks after burying my father, listening to a document that had apparently been created and signed during a 4-hour window I'd been told was a doctor's appointment, completely restructuring my entire understood future, and I want to describe the specific vertigo of that moment. Not just grief at losing my father, which I was still very much in the middle of processing. But a second, entirely separate shock layered directly on top of it. Discovering that the final week of his life had apparently included a legal transaction I had no knowledge of at all. I want to tell you what I did next, because it moved fast, and it revealed worse and worse details the longer I looked. I contacted our longtime family attorney immediately, the one who had drafted the original will years earlier, needing, urgently, to understand how something this significant could have happened without his involvement or knowledge. He was, I want to be honest, genuinely shocked. He confirmed he'd had no contact with my father in the final weeks regarding any will changes and told me, carefully, that the timeline I was describing, a new will signed 6 days before death, using a different attorney, accompanied by a single beneficiary with no other family members present, was, in his professional experience, exactly the kind of pattern that courts take seriously when evaluating potential undue influence or capacity concerns. I want to describe what came out over the following weeks, because it kept escalating, layer by layer, in ways I genuinely did not expect going in. I obtained my father's medical records for the specific day of the notary visit, through the estate proceedings that followed, and what they showed troubled me deeply. He had received a significant dose of pain medication that same morning, roughly 2 hours before the appointment Ingeborg had described, medication that his own hospice records, from other days around that same period, repeatedly noted as causing periods of reduced alertness and confusion, as a documented, expected side effect at his specific dosage level. I found the notary who had witnessed the signing, a woman who, once I explained the situation and the concerns being raised through the legal process, told me, carefully, clearly uncomfortable, but willing to speak once formally requested to by my attorney, that she had, in fact, had some hesitation about the signing at the time. My father had, in her account, seemed tired, a bit slow to respond to questions, though she'd ultimately proceeded because he had, when directly asked, confirmed understanding what he was signing, and because, she noted, Ingeborg had been present the entire time, helping him along a little, prompting him when he seemed to lose his train of thought. I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because it's the one that, once I fully understood it, reframed the entire situation for me. Ingeborg had not simply driven my father to the appointment. She had, according to the notary's own account, actively participated in prompting and guiding his responses during the actual signing, at a moment when his own medical records document significant expected impairment from pain medication administered that same morning. I confronted Ingeborg directly, once I had gathered enough of this information to feel prepared for the conversation, roughly 6 weeks after the initial will reading. She did not deny the basic sequence of events, though her framing of them was, predictably, entirely different from what the medical and notary records suggested. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of, she said. He told me, more than once, in those final weeks, that he was worried about what would happen to me once he was gone, and he decided, on his own, that the original arrangement didn't reflect what he actually wanted anymore. He was on significant pain medication, I said. The notary said she had to prompt him. This wasn't him making a clear, independent decision. This was you, taking him to sign something during a window when his own medical team's notes describe him as impaired. She insisted, repeatedly, over that conversation and several that followed, that his intentions had been genuine and clearly communicated to her privately, while before the actual signing, framing the notary appointment itself as simply the formal execution of a decision he'd already made with full clarity at some earlier, unspecified point. I want to be honest that I have no way of fully verifying what conversations may or may not have happened privately between them in those final weeks, and I've had to sit with that specific, unresolvable uncertainty as part of processing this entire situation. I want to tell you about the legal challenge that followed, because it was, in many ways, harder and more protracted than I expected going in. Contesting a will on grounds of diminished capacity or undue influence is, my attorney explained early on, a genuinely difficult legal standard to meet. Courts generally give significant deference to a testator's stated wishes, even late life changes, and successfully overturning a properly executed, notarized document requires clear, convincing evidence that goes well beyond simple suspicion about timing or circumstances. We built the case, over the following year, around the specific combination of factors that had emerged, the documented medication timeline, and its known cognitive effects, the notary's own account of needing prompting during the signing, the complete absence of any other family member or independent witness during the appointment despite my father's consistent, decade-long communication of different intentions to multiple family members, and, notably, to our original attorney, whose own files entered into evidence, documented years of consistent instruction entirely inconsistent with the final 6 days before death revision. The case ultimately settled, roughly 14 months after my father's death, rather than proceeding to a full trial. A negotiated resolution that restored a significant portion of what the original will had specified, though not the entirety, and preserved a meaningful provision for Ingeborg as well. A compromise that I want to be honest left neither of us fully satisfied, but that both our respective attorneys agreed represented a realistic, defensible outcome given the genuine uncertainty involved in litigating capacity and influence questions from that specific vantage point, over a year after the fact, with the one person who could have definitively clarified his own intentions no longer able to speak for himself. I kept the company, restructured under terms that gave me operational control while preserving a financial interest for Ingeborg, an arrangement that, while not what I would have designed from scratch, has allowed the business my father spent 35 years building to continue functioning under family leadership rather than being fractured entirely by the dispute. My relationship with Ingeborg has not recovered, and I don't expect it to. We communicate now almost entirely through our respective attorneys regarding the ongoing terms of the settlement, a formal, careful distance that I think, honestly, is probably the healthiest available option given everything that happened. I started therapy about 5 months after my father's death. Once the initial shock of both the loss itself and the will discovery had settled enough to leave room for it. My therapist has helped me understand that I was, in a very real sense, grieving two entirely separate losses that arrived on top of each other. My father's death itself, and a second, later grief about not knowing, with any real certainty, what his actual final wishes genuinely were, layered with the specific, unresolvable uncertainty about how much of that final week reflected his own clear thinking versus the medication and influence surrounding him during it. I think, more than anything, about that ordinary Tuesday morning, Ingeborg mentioning a doctor's appointment, in the same unremarkable tone she'd used for dozens of similar appointments over the preceding months, and how completely, invisibly, that specific 4-hour window ended up reshaping everything that came after it. While I went about my own day with no reason whatsoever to suspect anything unusual was happening at all. It's been about 2 years now since my father died. My sister Cordelia said something to me a few months after the settlement that I still think about often. She said, "We'll never actually know what he wanted in those final days, not with real certainty. But I think you did the only thing you could do with that uncertainty. You didn't just accept it quietly, and you didn't let anger consume the whole process either. You just tried to find out as much of the truth as anyone could actually find. And you built the best outcome you could out of what that truth turned out to be." I've thought about that a lot since. I think it's the closest thing to peace I've been able to find with a situation that, I've come to accept, may never fully resolve into the kind of clean, certain answer I originally wanted from it. If you've ever discovered that a loved one's final wishes had been altered during a window you had no visibility into, forcing you to reconstruct, after the fact, what was actually true versus what was simply convenient for someone else, I want to hear about it. I think there's something particularly difficult about grief that gets tangled up with legal uncertainty in this specific way, and something important about the slow, careful work of seeking clarity even when complete, unambiguous answers may never actually be available. 6 days. 1 signature. That's all it took to turn the end of my father's life into a question I don't think I'll ever be able to fully answer.